Hello friends, I'm Joker. In this tutorial, I'm going to tell you all about Object IDs, how you can get them, and what you can use them for. The whole world of Object IDs right now in Rec Room is made up of 4 gadgets. Those are the Object Trigger Zone, which is right here, the Object Respawner, this is the Object Mapper chip, and then there's the Set Tags chip. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of those, but first let's start with the basics of Object IDs. I'm going to go ahead and go to my point of view. All right, that should be good. So let's see. In order to, the basics of getting an object ID, the only way to get an object ID right now is to use an object trigger zone. This is an object trigger zone. Actually, let's spawn one. So to spawn an object trigger zone, you need to go to your gadgets menu, other gadgets, and then there's trigger volume. There's 2 types of trigger volume. When you create one, by default, it's a player trigger zone. It keeps track of players. And to switch it to an object trigger zone, hit the objects button in the configure menu. And there you go. Now you have a green object trigger zone. To get an object ID from an object trigger zone, you need to use either the red pin, which is when entering zone, or the blue pin, which is when exiting zone. Either of those will output the object ID when the object enters or exits. So let's use the when entering. The green pin only counts the number and doesn't show an object ID, so you're going to need red or blue. And first of all, so it's going to show you this for just a flash. Let's use this. This is a maker pen. This is a maker pen object I made. And this, when I drop into the trigger zone, it's going to enter, and it's going to send to this output chip the object ID. And so it only does it for 1 tick. So to get a better look at what an object ID looks like, let's go up here. I have one stored. Object IDs this is what they look like. They're usually, what is this, a 5-digit number, and they start in 9. So if you see something like that, it's probably an object ID. So red or blue pin, I'll go ahead and demonstrate the blue pin just because I can. The only difference between red and blue is this won't send it until it exits. So it's in the zone now, and when I pull it out, that's how you get. Okay, so that's how you get an object ID. The most important thing to remember right now about object IDs is that when you save a room, all the object IDs change. So right now, this has the object ID of 90,003, something like that. If I save this room, it's going to get a totally new object ID, and I won't be able to use that anymore. The number you need to know what the number is in order to use it, and I'll be showing you how to use it with the other 3 gadgets. So the trick with object IDs, at least for right now, is that you need to find a way to get them and then to use them while the room instance is running, while your game is running. Or not necessarily the game, but the room instance, while the room instance is running. So right now there are a couple of tricks you can use to do that, and I'll show you that up here. So before I jump, so there's 2 methods really. One's way more common than the other. The way to think about object IDs is, in order to get them, you need to be using the on-enter or on-exit pins of a trigger zone. So entering and exiting, when you think of that, what this means is something needs to be moving. You need to have an object move somewhere to somewhere else, or you need to have a trigger zone move through the object. That's how you get object IDs. And so the most obvious solution for that is to use what we're calling a sweeper, right? So you attach a trigger zone to a gizmo. Right here I have it set up to just a simple rotator, and it's rotating around, and I've got it passing through this laser gun, and you can see as it passes through, it is sending the object ID signal through the circuit, which is just displaying the number for a second before it disappears. So that's one method of getting an object ID, or at least establishing it. And what you do with it afterwards, we'll talk about in a minute. The other less often used method is what I'll call the cleanup trick. All right. So I've set this trigger zone up to use the when exiting pin, okay? Now the trick here is this shotgun, I have it set, it's sitting right here, and I've configured it with the respawn configuration, which you can go in configure menu and on the first page. You can set it to automatically, we call this cleanup sometimes. And that is when you grab the laser gun and you move it somewhere and then let go of it, it'll respawn. It'll respawn to that point automatically. That's just a quirky feature of Rec Room. Now you can use this by, if you move the laser gun into the trigger zone and then let it respawn, you'll see once it respawns, it sends the object ID because it exited the trigger zone, okay? So if you want to get an object ID, when a room loads, what you can do is configure it to respawn outside the trigger zone, but then move it inside the trigger zone. And then save, if I let this go here, and then I save the room before it respawns, when the room loads, it'll be inside the trigger zone. But after the cleanup time happens, it'll automatically exit, and then you'll have your object ID. Now, the problem with that is it's a little bit difficult to do that because when you're building a room, that basically has to be the last step when you're building a room. You have to remember, okay, now I need to put all my objects that for which I want object IDs into my trigger zones and save it real quick before they all respawn. That's tough to pull off. You can do that for maybe one or two objects in a room, and it saves you the ink of having to use a gizmo, but that is another way to do it. Okay, so a couple other notes before I stop talking about getting object IDs. It's important to remember decorative shapes. Okay, so right here I have this bag of bread that's made by a friend of mine. This is a maker pen shape, and it's set to decorative. Decorative shapes have no physics, and what that means is they don't collide with object trigger zones. And because they don't collide with object trigger zones, Rec Room has no way of knowing when they've entered or exited a trigger zone. So if I take this... Oh, that was my maker pen. Maker pens have object IDs, by the way. So if I take this and move it in and out, it's not reacting to it because it doesn't have any physics, and the game has no way of knowing that it has an object ID or that it's reacting to it. However, the good news is trigger zones, conveniently, let me set this to grabbable. Trigger zones do have object IDs, and they do have physics. And this includes both player trigger zones and object trigger zones. So I can actually use these. I'll just demonstrate this here. Get rid of that. You can actually use these as sort of dummy ways to activate circuits. Or if you want, you can get the object ID of a trigger zone, and you can move it around if you really need to, and that's good for some purposes, but I won't get into right now. Okay, and now that I'm thinking about it, all maker pen objects have object IDs. Props have object IDs, like you can see with the shotgun and the laser gun. All of the props have object IDs. Also, things like the maker pen actually have object IDs. Maker pen is understandably a little bit restricted because it's a powerful tool, but it does have an object ID, and if you can try and imagine something you can do with it, then good luck to you. The other thing, very useful, is the streamer camera. Streamer camera has an object ID. So, and what I'm about to show you is that means you can use the respawner and stuff to teleport it around, or you can detect who's holding it with an object mapper chip. Streamer camera, and I also believe, let me get rid of this before I forget. Ooh, there's a frame rate drop. Share camera. Oh. Uh-oh. Okay, yeah, there it is. Yep, share camera also has an object ID. So pretty much every object in Rec Room has an object ID. What you can do with it sometimes depends a little bit on the object, like the cameras are a little bit weird. You can't teleport those around just at will. Okay, so I've done all that. Okay, so yeah, before I move on to, we're going to talk about respawners and the chips. But first, storing an object ID is just like storing any number. There's two strategies. You can use this is a random number generator store method, where you send the number into all 3 pins and it just stores it. The other is, I haven't hooked this up yet, a ring store. This is just a combinator looped back on itself. And if I hook that up to the trigger zone, and then that exits the trigger zone, now I've sent the number in here and it's stored. And that's useful. Sometimes you need to keep a number somewhere. You need to keep that number somewhere in order to do something with it later. So that's so storing object IDs is important to know. Okay, so now that we know all about how to get an object ID, let's talk about how to use them. First one is the respawner. The respawner is pretty straightforward. Send the number. Okay, so the respawner's got 2 pins. Respawn object by tag and respawn object by object ID. We're not going to talk about tag today. That's something for another video. Object ID, it just looks for one of those numbers that's sort of like, 10,000 or 9,000, whatever it is, 90,000. And when it finds that number, it identifies the object and pulls the object into the respawner. Simple as that. And this is how you can teleport objects. So when I drop this in, oof, oh no. That was a bad idea. Okay. Sorry for the frame rate lag there, but I forgot that has a bunch of that's got a bunch of shapes in it. So let's use a laser gun instead. Okay. Should have thought of that. Okay. So yeah, when I drop the laser gun through, it respawns it. And there are some configuration options in the object respawner. I'll let you guys play with those. That's for another video. But for now, all you need to know is that's how you use the object ID with the object respawner. It's as simple as wiring it up. Okay. Now the object mapper chip. So the object mapper chip takes an object ID as the input. You can see here, that's what these all have in common. They're looking for object ID. Object ID, over here, object ID. It takes an object ID as the input, and then it looks, and then the game looks up the player IDs of the last held player. Player IDs that's going to be a different video. Player IDs, the last held player and currently holding player. You can use this for lots of stuff. But let me demonstrate. So, yep, I'm going to hook this one up to when exiting. Either one will work. But when I drop, so here's a ping pong paddle. Actually, wait. This isn't going to do what I need. I need to store this. Okay, so yeah, last held player. So here, yeah. For example, if I send the object ID, it's going to look up the last held player, and it's going to send my player ID, which is 1. Simple as that. Just input it into the chip, and that's what you can use it for. Also, I might as well do this now. If you want to see who's currently holding an object, you can. This is one of the reasons you can for storing. Sorry, this is one of the reasons for storing an object ID. Okay, so if I hook this up to a random number generator store, and then I'm always outputting. Let's use this right here. I'm always outputting that object ID. This chip is the object mapper chip is gonna monitor from moment to moment who is holding that object. So I drop this in here. Now I've got the object ID. Right now nobody's holding it because I dropped it. But if I pick it up, I drop it. I pick it up, and I drop it. It's saying who's holding. And if I had another player in here and they picked it up, it would show player ID 2 or whatever their player ID was. So that's the object mapper chip, briefly. There's more you can use that for. But let's talk about, so yeah, there's all of these, so these 3 gadgets are the basics of circuits. It's what you do with the gadgets. There's infinite possibilities for what you can do with the gadgets. These are just the basics of how they work. For example, we just finished competing in the contest, and we did the Bloodborne room, and I used the object mapper chip to detect when a player picks up the saw cleaver trick weapon. What that means is that's why when you juggle it like this, you toss it, grab it again. Circuitry knows that I've picked it up and dropped it, and so it opens and closes, and it plays the emitter and the sampler sound. So that's how we did that, using an object mapper chip, and we needed the object ID. See, it's stored right here, and then it's monitoring when picked up, and this circuitry just determines whether it's just been picked up or whether it's not being held. Okay, and the last one is the set tags chip. So set tags will, let's go into the configure menu for this. So set tags will take the object ID of the object, and it can either add a tag that you can set in here, remove it, or remove all the non-default tags from the object. So what I want to do is, I've got a trigger zone set up here that's filtering. You can set filters on object trigger zones, right? So this is filtering for the tag hashtag tutorial. So I want, right now, if I drop this basketball into this, it doesn't pass the, well, let's look at the basketball. If I look at this basketball, it's got the tag basketball, which is its default tag. And this is filtering for tutorial, so nothing happens. It's looking for the tag tutorial and doesn't have it. So I want to give it the tag tutorial. I could do that with the maker pen, but the point of the object mapper chip is that you give circuitry the ability to give tags, and you don't need a maker pen to do that. So let's configure that, and we'll type in tutorial. So now, and then we'll set it to add, and wire this up. Object ID input. This is, I believe, okay, so the output, I'm not going to worry too much about this, but I think the output is only when it's successful, or maybe it just passes through. But let's not worry about it right now. So here, there, object ID got sent, and now if I look at the basketball, I didn't add the tag myself, the chip added it, and now it's got the tag and it passes the filter. I could do the same thing with remove. And now object ID goes through, and now it won't pass the filter. So that's the set tags chip. Okay, that is everything currently there is to know about object IDs. Again, it's all about what you use them for. Before I end the video, I do want to mention we in the creator community have kind of got tired of having to use these methods, the sweeper and the cleanup, as the only way to get object IDs. So there are a couple of requests on Canny, and I will post them in the video description for easier ways to get object IDs. One of them is actually using a wire going straight from the object itself into an input pin, and the other one I think is just to is proposing to keep object IDs more permanent so that you can remember them and use them as between room loads. Okay, thanks very much for watching. See you guys in the next video.